Good morning.
Good morning.
Hazel and Ralph, thank you very much. Good job. Amy, you and your team, thank you for the love songs. We are in 1 John, and we will be talking a lot about love as we go through 1 John. But we're still laying foundations this morning as we look at Can You Stand the Test? Part 1. Have you ever heard the question, if you were on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? Think about that. I think you may have heard that question. If you were on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? I once heard of a fellow that was struggling. He was thinking about becoming a Christian, but he knew if the guys at work found out that he had become a Christian, he would take such a ribbing that it really challenged him. Well, the preacher worked with him and tried to explain to him that really doesn't matter and all those kind of things that went on wrong. And finally, the man relented and gave himself to the Lord and became a Christian, was immersed. And so the following Sunday, the preacher ran up to him and said, well, how did it go? Did it go as well as we said it would? The guy said, it was a breeze. Nothing to be concerned about. And the preacher said, see, I told you. He said, how did you do it? He goes, I didn't let him know I was a Christian. So that was a joke, guys. You can laugh at that. But that's serious. So this morning, as we're talking about taking a test, guess what? We're going to take a test. In your bulletin, if you notice on the outline, there are some questions that are there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of the 10 questions. I'll ask the question, give you time to write down an answer in your outline. And then we'll go back and we'll share the answers together. And then you grade it. I'm not going to grade it. I don't want to see it between you and God. First question, what is Jesus' mother's name? What is Jesus' mother's name? Second question, name one of Jesus' 12 disciples. You have a 1 in 12 shot at getting this one right. One of Jesus' 12 disciples. Third question, on what substance did Jesus once walk? And I don't want you to say ground or earth, or it's another substance besides the ground. Fill in the blank. There are 2 blanks here. For God so loved the blank that he gave his one and only blank. Number 5, at a wedding, Jesus once turned water into blank. How was Jesus killed? Number 7, who baptized Jesus? Number 8, who did Jesus say was his father? Number 9, who did Jesus raise after they had been dead for 4 days? And the last one, a little more difficult, but not really, if you think about it. What was Jesus' last name? All right. Everybody got their blanks filled in? All right, let's go. What was Jesus' mother's name?
Mary.
Mary, okay. Now, I'll do this one. Name one of the 12 disciples. It's either Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, John, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James, the son of Alphaeus, or sometimes he's called James the Less, Thaddeus, who's also called Didymus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot.
Do we get extra credit if we sing the song?
Sorry?
Do we get extra credit if we sing
No,
the
you don't get extra credit. No, you don't get. But it's good if you know all the ones. So. And if you know them in order. If you know them in order. Okay. On what substance Jesus once walked? Water. Fill in the blank. For God so loved the world that he gave his own one and only Son. At a wedding feast, Jesus once turned water into wine. How was Jesus killed? Crucified. Who baptized Jesus? John the Baptist. Who did Jesus say was his father? God. Who did Jesus raise after they had been dead for 4 days?
Lazarus.
Lazarus. And this one, what was Jesus' last name?
Son of Joseph.
Christ is not the answer. Christ was his title. It's either son of Joseph or Bar Joseph, which is kind of saying the same thing, or he didn't have a last name. So Christ was Jesus, not his last name, but his title. And that's kind of why I threw that one in there, because a lot of people think that. If you look at the writings of Paul almost always, not always, but almost always, reverses it and says Christ Jesus, putting his title first. All right. Get 10 points for every correct answer for a total of 100 points. And we're going to get back to that test a little later in the sermon. So, we're now going to, we did 1 week in 1 John. Now this is the second week. And so we're going to now do a 3-week mini-series in the middle of the series where we're going to talk about the 3 tests that John talks about. The tests of knowing that you're a Christian is basically the purpose of these tests that John does. And there are 3 tests. The first test, which is the test we're going to talk about today, is the moral test, the test of obedience. Next week, we're going to kind of get to that love thing when we do the social test, the test of love, and then the doctrinal test, the test of belief. So for this morning, as we do the moral test, the test of obedience, I want us to look at 3 things that John says in that, as he tells us to take that test. We're going to talk about, we know that, and then we'll say, yeah, I know, and then we'll talk about knowing completely. 1 John chapter 2, verses 3 through 6, and you'll see here that those topics show up within these 3 verses. And by this, we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commandments. Whoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his words, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we know that we are in him. Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walks. So I want to make a bold statement here. But I want you to listen very carefully to all of the words I'm saying in this statement. Because if you listen to some of it, you're going to misunderstand me. And I don't want you to misunderstand me. I want you to understand exactly what I'm saying here. And the bold statement is that anyone who tells you that you don't have to work at your salvation doesn't understand the Bible. Anyone who tells you that you don't have to work at your salvation doesn't understand the Bible. Now, I'm not talking about earning your salvation. You can't earn your salvation. And I'm not talking about doing enough good things to outweigh the bad things so that you get into heaven. Salvation is a gift of grace. It's a gift of God. It's undeserved. You can't earn your salvation. But you also can't just sit back and coast. When I'm on my motorcycle and I start to coast, guess what I do? I slow down. And if I go slow enough on the motorcycle, guess what happens? I fall over. So I don't like coasting on a motorcycle. I like going as fast as I possibly can. Of course, within the legal limits, Paul. We need to be working, not coasting. And so we know that is the first thing that we find from what 1 John tells us. Now, we know there's a lot of things that we know. I don't know if you've been watching sports, and one of my favorite sports is soccer. And right now, the Women's World Cup is going on, and I got to watch some really, really good soccer. The United States beat Spain, and they beat France, and they're going into the semifinals to play against England. And if they win that game, they're going to go into the finals. It's really good. So I want to use an illustration of something that we know of. Did anybody happen to bring a soccer ball with them this morning? Did anybody bring a soccer ball? We got a soccer ball here. All right. Thank you, Connor. All right. Something that we know is that what goes up must come down, right? What goes up must come down. So, now, unless you're in a rocket ship and reach the speed of 2,500 feet per second squared, then you will come back down. That's escape velocity, and that's how you escape gravity. But other than that, most of us move a little slower than that. What goes up must come down. But there are some things that we are not sure of. And so this morning, our basic question is, do we know Jesus? Do we know Jesus? We can change that to maybe, can we know him? Or how can I be sure that I know Jesus? I believe that the Bible is a simple book. We talked about that as one of those important biblical principles a couple of sermons ago. And so I think this answer is simple, though I think we make it more complex than it should be because it really is simple. In verse 3, it says, we know that we have come to know him, that's Jesus, if we keep his commandments. So yes, we can know Jesus if we obey Jesus by keeping his commandments. Our knowing is based on our doing. A quote from the Tyndale commentary on 1 John in page 90 says, "It is not the person who claims to be a Christian and to know God who is presumptuous, but he whose claim is contradicted by his conduct. He is a liar." That's a good way of saying it. But I think very often, too often, we try to convince ourselves that we know him, and so we overcompensate and we say, I know. You ever had a child or someone else when you're trying to point out to them that they don't really know, and they tell you, I know? We just took a little test and we graded it, and I hope you did really, really well. I hope you got a 100 or at least a 90 on that test. But I don't know if you realized that I was kind of setting you up, and I hope it works. Did you feel good about your grade? I hope you felt good if you got an 80, or got at least an 80 or 90 or 100. But I have another question for you. Is accurate information about Jesus the same as being personally acquainted with Jesus? Is accurate information about Jesus the same as being personally acquainted with Jesus? A couple of months ago, I did a sermon about Psalm 23, and at the end of the sermon, I had an illustration about two men that were asked to quote from memory the 23rd Psalm. There was the young man who was all schooled in all the right ways to say put the pauses and the emphasis on the right words. And he did a really great job, and he did such a great job that people leaped to their feet and applauded, wanted to hear it again, wanted to hear him quote other scriptures. And then there was the old man with the shaky voice that when he finished, there wasn't a sound. You could hear a pin drop. And the young man came forward and said, I know the psalm, but he knows the shepherd. You know, it's one thing to know facts about Jesus and not know Jesus. You know, just saying, I know Jesus without obedience makes us a liar. That's some strong things that maybe I don't want to even think about that. But it says in verse 4 that whoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commands is a liar, and the truth is not in him. John tells us not only are we a liar, but the truth is not in us. The truth, we're far away from the truth. And that's scary. When I think about that, when I think, could I be that way? It burns within me. It makes me feel very uncomfortable. I mean, I'm a Bible college graduate. When I went to Kentucky Christian, we took a test so they could gauge our biblical knowledge. And I remember taking those questions, and there were quite a few that I did not know. And if I were to take that test at the end of my Bible call, I'm sure I would have had a much better knowledge level than I had before I went into college. But being a Bible call, knowing all that stuff, can I still not know Jesus, even though I know about him? I'm now in my 5th year reading the Bible through in a year. And I'm proud of that fact. Because there were times when I took, a year off that was really 10 years. And I'm glad that I'm able to do it. I'm gaining knowledge and we're gaining information about Jesus. But could I miss knowing Jesus, even though I know about him, instead of knowing him? Bible reading is so different from Bible doing, isn't it? How does it make you feel? Verse 5 says, "But whoever keeps his word, obeying commands, is augmented by obeying his words." Have you ever heard somebody say, Jesus said it, I believe it, and that settles it? That's the way it ought to be. We were studying in Exodus in Bible study this morning, and we talked about how the people, when they heard the commands, they said, we're going to obey his commands. That's the way we need to do it. No questions, just like the kid with the cookie, right? True obedience causes you to be a complete Christian. So let's take this idea of obedience a step further, as John does here. To be able to obey his commands and obey his words, we need to walk as Jesus walked, behave as Jesus behaved. Verse 6 says, "Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked." Back to that basic question, do we know Jesus? If you tell me you know Jesus, I should expect to see that you walk as Jesus walked. But how do we know how Jesus walked? Well, I think it's simple. We need to read the Gospels. We need to see what Jesus did. I think that's very important. But I think we need not stop at reading the Gospels. We need to go further, and we need to read what comes after the Gospels. And for me, that's the most important part of the New Testament. I think it's great to know what Jesus did. But when I try to compare myself with Jesus, I fall a little short of that level. So that might apply to all of us. And when I look and I see what real normal Christians did, and I can identify with them. This same John who wrote 1 John, who wrote the Gospel of John, who wrote 2 John and 3 John and the book of Revelation, this John who loved Jesus and understood love in a better way than anybody, I think, in the New Testament, helps me. I can walk like Jesus because I see how John walked like Jesus. And I think of the Apostle Paul, who, as Saul of Tarsus, imprisoned and killed Christians. And yet God's grace shined on him and forgave him. I'd like to think that all of my sins combined so far in my life have not even come close to one of what the Apostle Paul did. And yet God was able to forgive him and work with him. And you can see very clearly how the Apostle Paul walked like Jesus did. Well, it's good to read the Gospels. It's good to read what comes after. But what about what comes before the Gospels? You look at the Old Testament and you see the things that good people, good, obedient followers of God did. Normal people. Again, I can do that. But I also see the bad things that happened. And I think, you know what? I don't want to go there. Because I see how God had to deal with them because they refused to obey him. I think what it comes down to, being walking like Jesus did, is to understand and allow grace to happen to us. We need to allow God to forgive us. Because you see, Satan lies to you with the truth. He tells you, you are not good enough. You really think that you can walk like Jesus? Be like Jesus? Do you really think you can? Is that too high of a standard for you? And so that's what he tells us. But he lies to us with the truth. It is the truth that we're not good enough. But the part he doesn't share with us is that God makes us good enough. We are not good enough. But God makes us good enough. We can know Jesus. We can obey Jesus. But do we? Maybe I can ask this question. Maybe we can ask this question to ourselves. Am I going to put in the effort to know Jesus' commands and words, or am I going to stand before him and be called a liar because I fooled myself all the way to the end? Am I going to put in the effort to know Jesus' commands and words, or am I going to stand before him and be called a liar because I fooled myself all the way to the end? You see, it's important to understand here that John is not writing to non-Christians. He's writing to Christians so that they can empower themselves to give them ways to know that they have what has already been promised. He wants the Christians to know that they need to obey, to show that they are Christians, not coast. Don't be fooled. Just taking up space in a church does not save you. Just taking up space in a church does not save you. If you go and sit in somebody's garage, does that make you a car? If you go to McDonald's, does that make you a hamburger? Just coming and sitting here doesn't make you a Christian. God's grace saves you. But our obedience to God's commands and words is what God asks of you as a response for what he has done for you. We know that we can know, but we also know that we can lie. We know we can completely know Jesus by walking as he walked, obeying his commands and words to the end. Right now, this minute, at 11:30 a.m. on June 30, 2019, you are either a Christian who obeys the commands and words of God, or you are a liar just by your presence here this morning. Let's look at that basic question that we've asked over and over. Do we know Jesus? But I changed it because, I don't think it's important that we know Jesus. The real question is, do you know Jesus? Obedience is the first test. Let's have a great week as the GCC family, loving God and loving people. Next week, we're going to look at the second test, the social test. The test, can I stand the test? And the test is love. Let's stand, let's sing. Come, if you have this.